Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this installment of Epic Insight. This is Chris Colangelo, Marketing Manager here at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and I will be your host for today's call. We're excited to be joined today by Lisa Tessara of Charles Schwab Bank to share with us the latest trends, tools, and tips in the always intriguing world of fraud targeting retirement plans. Lisa is the Managing Director of Client Services within Schwab Retirement Business Services, where she oversees and is responsible for the client service teams. She also acts as a spokesperson regarding retirement plan fraud and by helping educate clients on trends and best practices. She serves on the Spark Data Security Oversight Board and Defeating Fraud Committee and is also a member of the Investment Company Institute Bank Trust and Retirement Advisory Committee. Your line will be muted throughout the call, but if you have any questions you would like addressed at the end of the session, please enter them in the webinar control panel. With that, we'll turn it over to Lisa.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and giving me this time to chat with you about fraud. So as Chris mentioned, my primary day job is client services here within the Retirement Business Services Group in Charles Schwab Bank, but my part-time job has become fraud. And that's because in 2017, we had our first reported case of fraud in the retirement account space. So we'll talk through some of those details as part of our conversation today. We like to say to our clients, we don't like saying it, but encountering fraud is not a matter of if, it's when. And so, I think what we've been trying to do here at Schwab is really get out in front of all of our plan sponsor, advisor, third-party administrator clients and help to educate and provide resources and tools that they can use and also use with their clients and ultimately with participants to make sure that everybody's data and retirement accounts are protected. What we see here at Schwab, most common cyber threats, and I'll talk about some of these very specifically today. I'll target the ones that we've seen a lot of recently. Mail theft, good old-fashioned mail theft, which really isn't cyber-related, but often results from an electronic distribution that's initiated by a fraudster. Email account takeover is another one that we're seeing a lot of recently. And then I think all of you are probably familiar with phishing and social engineering, et cetera. So here's what we've seen specific to our division. And again, we've been tracking this since the first reported instance back in 2017. These are just reported fraud incidents. And so I'll talk a little bit about the details behind it. But we do have clients who may reserve the right to try to address a situation that involves fraud in-house and may not come to us for assistance in trying to recover the funds. But what we have seen is kind of all over the board, right? So our largest reported incident happened actually in 2017. That's the first one listed where a record keeper's participant website was breached and some sophisticated folks were able to write scripts and very quickly take distributions out of 51 different participant accounts, and that totaled over $5.5 million. You'll see in the recovery column, we have been successful in some types of fraud, around 50 to 60% recovery rate. But then there are other types of fraud that I'll talk about today where the fraudsters are increasingly sophisticated and therefore are able to have a much higher success rate of keeping the funds that they have taken illicitly. I'll key in on an email account takeover. So while we've only had 8 transactions or reported instances of this, that number has actually doubled just in the past 6 months. So up through April of this year, we'd only had 4 email account takeovers reported to us, and that number doubled. And what we found is that's where you're seeing a higher level of sophistication. So to kind of paint a picture, we are a directed trustee or custodian here at Schwab. We receive distribution requests typically in an automated fashion through files that are straight through processed from a record-keeping system sent by a TPA into our system. And in these particular instances, the transactions are coming right through because we're directed. And so the expectation is that a participant's request for a distribution is authenticated by the plan sponsor, unless for some reason they've given that responsibility to others. But 99% of the time, it's plan sponsors that are ultimately responsible for authenticating that participant is a real participant, that's a legitimate request that's being sent. And then we get it, from a TPA or other party who's also taking instruction from that plan sponsor. So I mention that because sometimes plan sponsors don't realize that under ERISA that is their responsibility. And that's also their responsibility then to make that participant in that plan whole immediately while the investigation is underway or the recovery of funds is underway. In the case of an email account takeover, the fraudsters are not only successful in getting the money out of that plan or participant's account, but they're also very successful moving it from the bank account to wherever they ultimately want that money to go. So what we typically see is that the fraudsters are not setting up their own bank accounts in someone else's name. They're using an existing bank account that is at a bank. That's information that they've also somehow been able to obtain, whether it's through the dark web or other means, social engineering, etc. And they'll move participant John Smith's distribution into Tammy Hayes' bank account, and then they are able to subsequently move that out of that bank account and either load it to a large debit card that allows large balances, or they'll move it offshore or to other accounts. In many instances, when you've got a less sophisticated fraudster, they're able to figure out how to take that distribution out of a participant account, but they cannot figure out how to get it out of the bank account. And we'll see them do some desperate things to try to move the money. In those cases, we're usually much more successful in helping our TPA and plan sponsor clients get the monies back. So usually what we find happens here at Schwab is about 2 weeks to the date that the distribution was taken, we are notified here at Schwab that it was fraudulent. And what happens is we still generate 1099s at the point of distribution as opposed to annually. And thankfully, the participants are actually opening those 1099s. They take a look and say, I didn't take this distribution. They contact their plan, who contacts the TPA and subsequently contacts us, and then we start our internal process. So we have a very large fraud and financial crimes group, over 400 people across our various sites. We have dedicated folks in that team that work with us, along with our distribution and cash management team who has bank relationships, and we start that recall process to try to get the bank account locked down, investigated, and hopefully the funds ultimately returned to the participant. So all in, we've seen about 97 different transactions in the past couple of years, totaling $10.2 million. Our recovery rate, as you can see, is less than 50% these days, mostly because of email account takeover, and there's that level of sophistication there. And so ultimately, there's been a loss of about $6.3 million that either had to been covered by a plan sponsor or, in some instances, a third-party administrator. I've got a few case studies, and I'm not going to cover every single slide. I know that Chris and Epic will make the slides available to you all after the webinar. There's also some links in here that will take you to helpful content and resources, but I did want to highlight just a couple of these for you, and these are actual cases or instances of fraud that we've seen here. So the first one I talked a little bit about, and that was when that record keeper website was hacked, the participant website, and the distributions were taken through ACH. This record keeper subsequently turned off ACH capability for a period of about 2 years, 2.5 years, and only recently turned ACH back on. We have other TPAs and record keepers who have also turned off ACH distributions. So it's interesting, right? It's always about people getting their money faster, and now we're starting to kind of hit the rewind button and go back in time a little bit, and some of our third-party administrator clients feel like if you can distribute it via the old-fashioned check, that maybe that slows things down, or you're more easily able to identify or thwart a fraudster. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing more good old-fashioned mail fraud, checks being stolen or intercepted in the mail, or an account is hacked into, an email or physical address is changed, and then the fraudster proceeds to have the money sent to their own address or a different address than that of the participant. The other case study that I wanted to highlight a little bit for you is this here. So email account takeover, again, a higher level of sophistication. This is where, in our instance, what we like to call the human firewall, our people. This person was able to kind of pick up on different email nuances from his particular client, where it just didn't seem like she was quite herself. She seemed a little bit out of character, as it were. And so after several emails that she sent in to him, he picked up the phone and called her and said, "Hey, what is it that you're trying to do this morning?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you sent me several emails about the account balance and wanting to take a distribution." And she said, "I didn't send you any emails." So this was a situation where her email account had been taken over or compromised. And so we immediately began the process to lock down their access to actually come into our Schwab Retirement Center and other venues. We locked it down for their entire firm until they could really investigate and find out, how broad of an issue that was for them. So again, email account takeover, they're quite sophisticated. So glad that our folks, kind of picked up on something and called out. Again, mail fraud is something that we're seeing a lot of, and, this can happen in a variety of ways. What I would say is we've seen an uptick very recently. The dollar amounts are smaller than what we see for some of the electronic fraud that we're seeing, but it's still happening. And what's interesting here is it can happen whether it's gone through the USPS or UPS or FedEx. We had a situation with a participant who received a check, left it in her overnight envelope that we sent it to her in. She walked into Bank of America. She ripped open the envelope and said, "I want to deposit this check and open an account for my daughter for her college." And Bank of America said to her, "This check's already been cashed." In that particular instance, we believe that somewhere along the line, there's a potential that someone actually remote deposited that check. So took a picture, maybe put it back in the envelope. And so we work with UPS and the U.S. Postal Service to really understand what are their risk mitigation and controls. Do you have cameras in your processing areas? What about in your delivery trucks? By the way, they don't have cameras in the delivery trucks. So there are different kind of flavors to this, the mail fraud. But again, seeing quite a bit of that. We'll move into security practices and behaviors. So really what I wanted to share with you all here is some of the resources and tools that we make available to our advisor, plan sponsor, and third-party administrator clients. And a lot of this is available through our Schwab Advisor Center. If you don't have access to that website and you would like access, feel free to reach out to Epic or to Schwab directly, and we're happy to set you up with that access so that you can leverage some of these materials. So this is just some of the information that's out there. These are PowerPoint decks that you can customize and use either with your clients or with your employees. You can add your logo and use that in any way that you would like. We talk a little bit about, responding to a breach and what's important here. We actually have flyers that you can download and share, and this is all, again, within Schwab Advisor Center, within our Cybersecurity Resource Center, which is really robust. I strongly encourage you to leverage the materials and the information that is out there. We share it with a lot of our clients. They found it to be extraordinarily helpful. And these are just more tips that are out there that, again, you can share with clients, with your employees. Additional resources that we have outside of advisor services. Well, let me back up. These are some of the additional resources within the Cybersecurity Resource Center. So, our vendor due diligence list, third-party vendor listing is very helpful. There literally is a step-by-step approach that will take you through how to determine if you've got good controls in place, do you have vulnerabilities or weaknesses. So a lot of really good information that you can self-service there. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of additional resources is we've been doing a lot of work through SPARC and the Data Security Oversight Board with the Department of Homeland Security's CISA, which is their Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency. This is an agency that was formed a few years ago, has really started to get traction, and now has branches all over the United States. These branches are staffed with agents who will come into small, mid-sized businesses and do no-cost penetration testing. So if you don't have your own technology department or IT group, and you want some help understanding if your participant website's great, if your internal processes and systems are secure, they will actually come in and do that penetration testing at no cost to you and provide you with an assessment of opportunity areas where you might want to, put some additional controls in place, et cetera. They won't help you to remediate that part, but again, this is no-cost penetration testing and assessments. We had a member of the Denver office join us recently. We hosted an event in conjunction with the DHS, Spark, and other industry groups out at our Denver campus, and he was terrific. Just provided a lot of information. Again, these guys are boots on the ground. They're in local offices around the United States, and all of the services that they offer are free to you. They say when they mention the word free, nobody wants it, so they like to say no cost. But I can't stress enough how valuable the resources are there. These are really smart individuals with some pretty impressive backgrounds. And again, it's at no cost to you and your clients. Other resources that are here can be used at different levels. So the Stay Safe Online is probably good for participant, employee level education. You can also visit the FBI site to look at different scams and things that are going on. The other thing that I would share with you on the right, the reporting of cybercrime. So if something has happened to one of your clients' accounts, the IC3 form, which is on the lower right-hand side, is a really important form. It should be part of your process when you're reporting a crime. I've had clients say to me, well, if it's not more than $1 million, they won't help you out. Well, they may not be able to help you out, specifically if it's less than $1 million, but what they do is they take in all of that information, all of that intelligence, and they actually are able to mine that to look for commonalities across the retirement industry, looking for different types of fraud patterns or organized groups who are perpetrating fraud that might look unrelated, but for the DHS, CISA, and the FBI, they're actually able to identify those patterns and potentially go after folks who might have hit up, a Schwab or a Putnam or a Fidelity, and maybe independently we just think it's one instance, but it's really actually three things being perpetrated by the same group or organization. So that was really everything that I had to share with you today. I know I went through that rather quickly, so Chris, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. We'll open up the floor to a few minutes of questions. If you have something you'd like to run by us, please take a moment to enter it in the panel now. I would throw out a question of just wondering what, if any, methods that you can provide for plan sponsors to better police their end of things, other than penetration testing, just
right.
Outside of following what they're supposed to do.
So we talk about a lot of these things. It's layers. There's no silver bullet, right? So there has to be, employee education. There needs to be authentication, dual factor authentication. If you're able to leverage biometrics, that's even better. Device ID, machine learning. We have different things here at Schwab, and I recognize, we probably have access to a little bit more than maybe some smaller shops, but we literally have voice imprints and identification. We have a bank of voices that we know to be imposters and fraudsters, and we're able to run things against that to screen out fraudsters and to direct them into a different call center group, for example, that's trained to handle, fraudsters and folks like that. What I would say is the authentication piece of the distributions is so critical, and recognize that can be difficult if you've got a large organization or if you're, located in multiple places. But I know for smaller sponsors, sometimes it's, making sure whatever process you have in place works and that you don't deviate from that process. So I'll give you an example. We had a plan sponsor, a greenhouse firm, and they had a fraudulent distribution for one of their participants for $50,000. And I spoke with their in-house attorney, and she said to me, what do we need to do and what can we do differently? And I asked her, I said, when you get a distribution request, typically, how do you handle it for your folks? How do you handle it for those employees? And she said, well, they come into the office and they give us a form. And I said, okay, that's awesome. I said, well, what about in this particular instance? What was different? She said, oh, yeah, this was submitted to me electronically. And I said, so there you kind of deviated from your process, and maybe if you're small enough that you can actually require people to come into the office and submit a form, then maybe that's the process you want to stay with. But really what we talk about is you've got to hit it on all levels. So employee education, detection, prevention, very important. Having a plan in place for the what ifs. The other thing that we think is very important for plan sponsors, for third-party administrators, advisors, is look into having cyber and fraud insurance, fraud/theft. That is not typically covered in your general liability policies, and you really want to have those as separate policies. Our understanding is the cost is about $2,000 a year, and we do have clients who have had to pull the trigger and leverage some of those insurance policies to recover funds that were fraudulently taken. So those are some of the things I would recommend.
Great. So is there a particular plan type, design, or even an industry that's targeted more than others in fraud?
That's a great question. So yes, highly compensated employees are the favorites, of course. And as you know, you can go to a website for any company and quickly figure out who the officers and the senior executives are. And so fraudsters target, they love doctors, lawyers, engineers, and architects. But we see doctors a lot. They really go after the doctors, the MDs. And we've seen situations where they provide fake IDs, that just so many variations, and they've been able to take quite a bit of money. We had one where they took 3 distributions totaling about $700,000, and the TPA on that one said to me, well, gosh, we require, a photo ID before we'll process a distribution, which was great, but the photo ID was fake. And so, yeah, you see situations like that. So highly compensated employees are definitely where we see a lot of the fraud happening.
And then a real quick one, the tools you mentioned in the advisor resource site, they're available to everyone?
Correct. So if you don't have access to the Schwab Advisor Center today, you can reach out, like I said, either through Epic or, to us directly, and we're more than happy to get you set up with access to Schwab Advisor Center. We're also featuring more of those materials on the Schwab Retirement Center, which is the website that we have for our TPA plan sponsor advisor clients as well. And again, if you don't have access, we're able to grant that to you depending on your relationship with Schwab and with particular plans. But unfortunately, none of that's made available just by going to the public site. But we're happy to get IDs. And Schwab Advisor Center is probably much more robust. So if you don't have access, let us know. We'll help you out with that.
Great. Thanks again, Lisa. And thanks to Charles Schwab Bank Retirement Business Services. That's all we have for questions. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this Epic Insight webinar. As another reminder, we will be sending out a copy of today's slides along with a link to a recording of the session in the next day or so. And if you have any questions or would like more information on the tools mentioned today, please feel free to reach out to your Epic service or sales team. We appreciate your partnership and look forward to seeing you at our next session. Have a good day, everyone.